So, welcome to this Travel Weekly webcast. I'm Ian Taylor, and I'm joined today by Huw Merriman, the Conservative MP for Bexhill and Battle and the chair of the Transport Select Committee. Welcome, Huw.
Thank you, Ian. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, thank you for joining us. I hope it turns out to be a pleasure. Huw, you've been highly critical of the government in its policy towards international travel. Why?
Well, I think if you look back over a year and a half, we've lagged behind other countries when it comes to providing safe standards for travel, taking advantage of the latest technology. So testing was very critical. The UK was very slow to the races on using testing to ensure that there's confidence from those passengers that are using international travel, but also that we can open it up more. And then I've been critical this year because we've been very quick out the blocks in terms of our vaccine rollout. It's been a huge success, and we all expected to see some form of vaccine dividend for the country, and that includes the international travel sector. And yet again, we're lagging behind Europe, who we were looking back some months ago saying, how could they be so slow to roll out a vaccine? They're now ahead of us in terms of easing restrictions. So I just feel there's been a huge cost to the international travel sector. 5,000 jobs per month have been lost since last March, and people have been unable to go and see their loved ones and get around the world and to trade and to ultimately enhance not just their lives but our economy. So I just feel the government has just been unnecessarily cautious, and we've lagged behind, not just since the vaccine but before that. And I think that's a shame, Ian, because the UK has actually led the world when it comes to aviation safety, the manual on standards, and yet we haven't driven it, and we haven't anywhere near led it when it comes to rolling this out.
Well, why has the government been so cautious, would you say?
I think part of it, you could look back and say the public felt that there was a bit of a free-for-all when it came to international travel. We had all the restrictions in this country, and yet we didn't stop international travel. Arrivals coming in, there was no quarantine, there was no testing. And I do wonder whether some of it is an overreaction to maybe a policy in the early months of 2020 where the government was perhaps too lax. And I think that as a result, the government has perhaps been driven by public opinion, that it was too lax. And as a result, I now think it's been overly cautious. So we've kind of gone from one extreme to the other, I'm afraid.
Okay, you've written to the Prime Minister, haven't you, with a series of demands, really, seven demands, seeking greater transparency for one thing on the decision making and the criteria. Do you want to explain that and maybe say also why you think the government hasn't been more transparent?
Yeah, so we've had the Global Travel Task Force, and one of the matters that it trumpeted was that it would try and give the industry, indeed the public, more time when a country was going to move from green to amber. But we had no time at all when Portugal was moved over. So I've really asked what's happened to this traffic light watch list, the green watch list. I want to know what the decision-making process was in terms of transparency. Why did Malta not move to green when the evidence suggested it could? Indeed, we hear the scientists recommended to government that it could. Equally, why did Portugal move to amber, where again, it doesn't appear that that was the advice. So if the government is following the advice, then I would like to see what that advice was and to have it published. We want to know what conditions a country will be moved straight from the green list to the amber list. We want to know what's going on in terms of the recommendations from government. So why is it that amber countries are moderate risk, and yet it's a recommendation that UK residents do not travel abroad? How long is that going to last for? I've asked about government sector specific support, because quite frankly, if the government are going to say to the industry it can't operate, then surely it has to compensate for stopping the industry from operating. And that also means potentially extending the furlough scheme for international travel. And then also some form of individual assessment of the country's coronavirus risk. Again, we've been told that there will be reviews into specific countries, but it seems as if decisions are being made perhaps more for political and general reasons rather than looking at the science. And ultimately, Ian, what I'm really asking for is what's the milestone that allows us to get back to some form of normality when it comes to international travel? When I asked the Secretary of State in the House of Commons chamber, his answer was there are unknown variants that could be at play, so therefore we can't put a date on it. Well, that's no way to operate. That will always be the case. So therefore, we'll never be able to fly again using that logic. So really asked the Prime Minister to really clarify that and asked him what the milestones would be from a public health perspective. Would, as I suggested, it be when all people aged 50 and older and the clinically vulnerable have been offered 2 vaccinations? Would that allow us to ease restrictions? So I'm looking for a bit of evidence base as to what this policy is. And I have to say, it was the Secretary of State for Health's response to me that really wound me up and got me writing to the Prime Minister to get more guidance. So we'll have to see what comes back.
And as chair of the Transport Select Committee, would you expect, you know, a response to each of those asks, or you know, in any detail, or would it be normal for just to get some, you know, fudge? Yes.
Yeah, well, all my questions start with will, when, under what conditions, is it your recommendation? These are all questions that can be answered if there is indeed a policy. Let me flip it the other way and say that if I don't get specific answers, then that will tell me that there is not sufficient clarity of thought and a real policy that makes sense. And we have a long-term strategy for getting us out of this situation. So in a way, I won't be too disheartened if I don't get specific answers, because it will actually just tell me that there is not a proper policy in place and a strategy to get us out of this situation. So that will then, of course, cause me to do more work.
Okay.
But you know, my job is to try and hold all those to account and to scrutinise government, and that means the very head of the government as well.
And you've asked for the Prime Minister to commit to sector-specific support if there isn't significant expansion from the next review, June the 28th, or the first review of the traffic light system anyway, June the 28th. Is it realistic to expect a significant expansion to be announced on Monday, really? Do you expect that?
Well, I think it's fair. I mean, to a certain extent, it's not just international travel that's now being restricted from doing business from government, because the hospitality sector appears to have that for another month at least. But I was working on the basis that if the domestic restrictions had all been eased, which was the reasonable expectation when I wrote that letter to the Prime Minister a week or so ago, then it would just be the international travel sector that was left with basically being compelled by government not to do business. And in my view, if the government tells an industry not to do business, then the government should compensate the industry for that direction. So that was the reason why I put that timing in place. I recognise it's not the only one, but there has to come a point in time where there is a sector-specific support package, because if this is the only sector that can't deliver the business that people appear to want to do, then it should be compensated. Look, I'm not in for subsidies from government. We've got a huge bill to pay for coronavirus restrictions and the pandemic. You know, the thought the government should actually be allowing business to do its operations, so we actually get a tax yield from it. Not just people get a chance to live their lives again, but we actually start to pay for the NHS, and that's what the international travel sector does. So, you know, for me, it's a good conservative principle. The sector doesn't want subsidies. It actually just wants to be able to do business. If the government won't let it do the business, then I'm afraid it will have to pay the subsidy. That, to me, seems only fair.
And one of the things in your letter, you asked the Prime Minister for a commitment to extend furlough through to April for aviation and travel. Are you hopeful of that? There's been no indication thus far, has there, from the Chancellor that there'll be an extension?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't want to prejudge what comes back, but it gets to a point in time where, you know, the government will need to look at this and say, right, when things like furlough come to an end, which I believe should be the case, there are certain sectors where the industry is struggling to actually get people back to do the jobs that the industry really needs them to do. So that's one challenge. But equally, if there's going to be another sector that's not going to have that benefit, and where we're losing over 5,000 jobs per month, then we need to keep furlough running until such time the government is giving the green light for all travel. And so if that's not occurring, then I think it's only feasible and reasonable to expect furlough to continue for this sector.
And other uh, measures of support, what sort of thing would you like to see?
Well, I mean, it's interesting actually. The sector itself has pointed to air passenger duty as a sort of temporary boost to incentivise. I mean, it's an interesting one, because I think really the bigger issues are cost of testing and quarantine and restrictions that go in. I'd certainly like to see VAT on testing taken out. It just seems a bit perverse
Yeah.
that the government effectively makes money out of this situation. So that doesn't seem right to me. Furlough I've mentioned before, and possibly more business rate cover as well. So ultimately those are the things that I feel would actually help, and certainly the industry points to. But as I say, my real hope is that this isn't needed, because if the government eases the restrictions and isn't so cautious, then the industry won't be taking money from the government. It'll be paying it in the form of tax revenue. So that's what I prefer to see.
Yeah, you were PPS to the Chancellor for a time, weren't you, when Philip Hammond was Chancellor? So do you have a feel for how the Treasury will look at requests for sector specific support?
Yes, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the Treasury feel that they've written a huge check to the nation. The nation's written its own check, over £300 billion, and so the feeling now is that that needs to be repaid. So I can see why the Treasury would not be looking to add to that bill any further, and will be looking very much at its receipts. And that's why I really would like to see the Treasury partner up with the Department for Transport to really put the pressure on those departments. Maybe it's the Cabinet Office, maybe it's the Department for Health, who are a lot more cautious and are probably behind the decisions to keep the travel industry restrictive as it is. So in a way, I don't necessarily expect the Treasury to have to write checks here. I'd rather they actually wrote mandates and support letters to help the Department for Transport in its quest to help the international travel sector unlock. So that would be as welcome as check writing, in my view.
Okay. Since you wrote the letter to the Prime Minister, we know now the domestic relaxation's been postponed to July the 19th. Is that now a realistic date for reopening international travel, would you say? July the 19th or soon after July the 19th?
I'm afraid that's my hunch. I mean, obviously, I don't know, but it would be slightly unusual with the controversy about not easing the final restrictions on the domestic market to then go faster on international. So I'd be very surprised. I think perhaps the best we can hope for is the next review phase is due for the 28th of June in terms of what the traffic light rules should look like. And maybe we would hope that there will be some indication at that time that whenever this domestic terminus day, as the Prime Minister calls it, will be, which may be the 19th of July, then we will also see a move for those that have been double jabbed to be able to visit amber countries as if they're green countries, so no need to home quarantine. So maybe that's the best we can actually hope for right now. It would be unusual for us to see international travel being opened up before the domestic restrictions completely brought to an end. So I hope maybe it's just signalling more hope and maybe a forward date, but it wouldn't actually kick in until at least the 19th of July.
Yeah. Are you heartened in that case then by the reports that the government is now seriously looking at recognising fully vaccinated passengers at the border so people could return without quarantine and testing?
Yes, I am. It's something that as a committee we've called for over the months in terms of where is the ability to help those that have been jabbed access international travel. I mean, that was this is one of the reasons for taking the jab. It's so that people could get on with their lives as well as protect lives. So I'm heartened to see it. I think it's really important that using this time where this won't take place, then the officials inside government are working with the travel industry to make sure that the technology is in place so that my NHS app, which at the moment only shows I've had one jab, but will show that I've had two jabs, actually connects through the passenger locator form so that I can ease my way nicely through the airport. So where I've been frustrated with government over the year is that sort of dead time that's there. The government have then not been working with industry to ensure that when things open up, the technology is all in place to allow for greater numbers to get through our airports. And we've seen that with sort of digitization, e-gates as well. So I'm sort of pushing for government to make sure they use this idle time to make sure that if 19th of July is that day, then the NHS app works, is compatible with what the industry have got, and people can actually get out there. And then the other part that would need to be borne in mind is that for those people coming into the country that have been double jabbed, then we need to be able to recognise their proof of vaccination as well, because international travel works on a two-way basis. Are people going abroad and they're people coming to us? And so we're going to need to be a little more flexible. And if countries haven't got the equivalent of the NHS app, they've got written evidence, say, then we need to be flexible to ensure that can be used as proof on entry.
Yeah, the EU digital COVID certificate will help, presumably, at least with member states. Anyway, you've asked the PM to clarify, should people travel abroad? The messaging from the government has been extraordinary in how confused it's been. Why has it been so confused? Is it that they don't agree amongst themselves, that it changes so often? What's behind that?
Well, there are many theories. One of which is that it was sort of written in terms of the language of do not travel to the amber list unless the journey is one of those exempted. That got sort of written in as a sort of health message and took other parts of government by surprise. It's incredibly unhelpful because when you look at the International Travel Task Force, the amber traffic light was there as minimal risk, not completely green, but lower risk. And yet lower risk to me doesn't equate to do not go. So it's completely contradictory and left passengers in a bit of a state of flux because they thought that they would be able to travel abroad as long as they themselves recognized that they would have to home quarantine, take tests, but if they were willing and indeed financially able to do so, then it was down to them. Then all of a sudden they receive a message that says, actually, you should not be traveling. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, the whole idea of having a system where you take those mitigations into effect so that people do have to stay at home and they do have to test is because that mitigates the risk. So if you don't wish people to travel in the first place, don't even come up with a rule set that allows them to do so and then take those mitigations. So I found it absolutely nonsensical and incredibly frustrating, and rather summed up the muddled process we've been living with up to today.
Yeah, it is extraordinary. All the opposition, or most of the opposition to the government policy on international travel, though, has come from within the Conservative Party, hasn't it? Which also seems rather extraordinary. Why is that?
I describe it as a political race to the bottom in terms of which front bench, be it SNP, Labour, and indeed, parts of my own government, can actually try and come up with the most draconian international travel policy that really just seeks to seal off our border. I'm afraid I can only conclude that it seems to work well with certain voters that perhaps don't need to go abroad and don't look outside these shores. But I find it really frustrating. And actually, there was the opportunity last week where there was an opposition day motion. So it's when the opposition get the chance to put a motion down, where they were effectively seeking to turn the amber list into red. And then, of course, right at the very end, they then throw in a line about more support for the international travel community. And my point was, they don't need the financial support. They actually want policies that allow them to do business. And turning the amber list to red doesn't allow them to do business. And it's totally nonsensical because, of course, the question I then ask is, well, what about the tens of thousands of HGV movements that come in delivering our essential goods and trade? Oh, well, they'll be exempt. Well, as soon as you exempt one sector, actually, ironically, coming from countries that could be a lot worse than others, then you've sort of penetrated the ring of steel, and then there isn't a ring of steel. So therefore, what's the point in just compromising the travel community? It doesn't make sense at all. And they always look and say, "Oh well, Australia." Well, we are not Australia. We're sort of 20 miles or so from Calais. We used to be part of the European Union. We're still very much part of Europe, and that's our trade movements show. And so to try and make out that you can just put a ring of steel and that will protect us from the next wave when we've already been vaccinated to such degrees is, to me, just politics. And it's maddening, as you can probably tell. And so I actually, in a way, whilst I've been critical of my own government, the opposition policies are much worse and would do even more damage to the travel sector than my own government is. And I think parts of the government have actually stood up really well, made sure we do have an amber list, made sure there is that flexibility. And quite frankly, if the Labour motion got carried and was policy, then I think it would just finish the travel industry off completely.
Okay, so politics is behind a lot of the decision making and the response of other politicians. There's a belief in the travel industry, really, that the government just doesn't understand the value of international travel. Would you say that's true, or in the case of the pandemic, is it that the government has just had other priorities and international travel isn't one of them?
Well, I think it's interesting, isn't it, between the sort of private and public, and what's seen as a public asset and what's seen as a private business. So if you look at rail, for example, it's received a subsidy of £10 billion just to keep on running. I mean, effectively, it's been nationalised by the back door. And yet, when you look at international transport, aviation, it's been largely left to its devices. Yes, it's been able to receive the same support that my football club Arsenal has, but it hasn't actually received this kind of strategic cover that perhaps other countries have thrown over their aviation businesses. So if you look at the support that the US and mainland Europe have given to their own carriers, it's been vast compared to our own. That's going to sort of have bigger ramifications for our own businesses, because you'd almost expect those states to then help their businesses and give them preferential treatment when better times return. So I think part of the issue is that it's seen as private, it's seen as for the market to manage. And also, I don't think we understand the strategic value of aviation and international travel, which is frustrating because we keep banging on about global Britain and having more trade deals and bringing more trade in. We don't seem to understand that 40% of everything that we bring in from outside the EU comes in the belly of passenger planes. So if you haven't got those passenger planes, then you don't bring the freight in, or the prices increase, which is what's happened. And there's a knock-on effect to consumers. So I just feel that we don't properly understand and therefore value international travel aviation in the same way. And it was notable when we spoke to Heathrow Chief Executive John Holland Kay. He explained that his counterpart over at Charles de Gaulle was speaking to the Secretary of State of Transport in France on an almost daily basis, and he hadn't spoken to ours for weeks, indeed months, as I recall. That was sort of at the height of the pandemic mid last year. So I think that probably just demonstrates that it's seen as private rather than a public and strategic asset. I'm not saying it should be public, don't get me wrong. I believe in the private sector, but I think we should just value it for more than just carrying people around.
Yeah, it does seem extraordinary given that the UK aviation sector is about 50% bigger than the German aviation sector, when the German economy is about 50% bigger. You've also written to the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, with a series of asks. How concerned are you that there'll be terrible queues at the borders, at airports, if there is a significant restart of travel?
Yeah, well, I am, because I'm concerned in a way that the bandwidth of border force and the inability to reprocess people quickly, has two issues. Firstly, it encourages government not to open up for fear that we can't cope. And secondly, the queues and people mixing from sort of red zones, green zones actually deters the traveling public from international travel. I mean, who wants to be stuck at an airport for 6 hours with someone that might be from a country that's on the red list? So yeah, I think it's another one of those points of not just being critical of current policy, but really encouraging government and officials to get ready for the next wave and ensure that once, by wave, I mean wave of movement, not wave of COVID. And that, when that date comes, whenever it will be, the weeks leading up to it have not been idly spent. They've actually been spent getting ready for business. And so those are really the sort of questions to the Home Secretary.
Okay. You'll be aware there's an travel industry lobby of Parliament on Wednesday. I'm assuming you support that. I think you'll be out to talk to people. Is this something the industry should have done before?
Well, I wouldn't criticise the industry. The industry has been on its knees, and if I'm trying to work out my bottom line and whether I can continue to operate, then I haven't really got time to come and schmooze around Parliament. So absolutely no criticism of the industry at all. I think the workforce, the business leaders that I speak to have been absolutely heroic, and have refused to give up. Have always believed that they will get us through this, have come up with solutions, not just sat on the sidelines and criticised. So there'll be no criticism from me. Very much looking forward to meeting the workers that are impacted, the businesses, the umbrella organisations that represent them. I think it's excellent. What I would really, really like, and it goes back to my point before, is that for MPs from all sides to push their own front benches to do more. So that means that government, Conservative MPs should really be challenging the government to make sure we come up with the solutions, and that the Department for Health sign them off, so that more people can travel without restrictions, without cost. But that also means that Labour and SNP MPs don't just do the classic and criticise the government, it's all their fault. They also persuade their own front benches to come up with more liberal policies, not more restrictive policies. And rather than a race for the bottom, we actually have a race for the skies, so that it's a positive thing for all political parties to be championing. So, my message to the industry is don't let these MPs get off the hook. Don't let them say one thing to you about how supportive they are, and then you watch them in the chamber, as I do, effectively trying to clamp down on travel. Really hold them to account, and make sure that they then hold their front benches to account, because that's the only way change is going to happen. So I think it's a great lobby. I hope it's going to come down, and sort of enjoy it, be positive, really be ready to persuade politicians that more needs to be done, and argue their corner.
Okay, and do you support the legal challenges to the government? The Manchester Airports Group, the airlines are seeking a judicial review, seeking really some of what you've asked for in your request of the Prime Minister.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, if you look at I think the first couple of questions that I've asked the Prime Minister seems to also be on the statement of action from the parties, and you mentioned Ryanair, Manchester Airport Group, I believe have been joined by others, who want the same information. They basically want to see what the advice was from the scientists, from others of government, and whether government followed that advice, and some transparency, so that the decision making is understood. So obviously the legal action is a matter for them. My job as a politician is to try and get the same transparency, the same details that they're seeking from the courts, and that's what I'm hoping I'll do. So we'll see who gets there first, the sort of political solution or the legal action.
Okay, and finally, Huw, what do you hope to achieve from the aviation debate on Thursday?
So again, I think it's a case of continuing to push, challenge, scrutinise government and other political front benches, as I've mentioned, and also come up with the ideas, solutions, and suggestions to open up, to be less cautious, to rely on the success of the vaccine, the evidence that tells us that once you've got the over 50s and the clinically extremely vulnerable jab twice, then 99% of the mortality risk is covered. To also remind the government that this vaccine that we've led the world in delivering is safe and effective against all known strains of the virus, and therefore the evidence points us towards being able to open up, allow the industry to recover, and to really open up the demand that we know that's there, and to allow individuals to go on a holiday. Holiday is not to be a dirty word. What's the world come to when people are embarrassed to talk about wanting to go on holiday? And allowing people to go and see their loved ones and to drive international trade that drives increased yields for the Treasury, that pays for the NHS, that delivers the vaccine. So, it's all about putting that message across. So I hope, not as much moaning. I think it's really important that we talk positively now about why it's safe to ease the restrictions on international travel, why some of these ideas being talked about for the double jabbed are great ideas. So, less moaning, I think, and actually more positivity and more optimism that now is the time to ease these restrictions. That's what I will be focusing my speech on, and I'm sure others will do likewise as well.
Less moaning, that would be very good. Huw Merriman, thank you very much indeed.